When did my husband's mother finally cross the line? I'd been with my husband for 3 years, and his mother still came into our house unannounced every morning to cook him breakfast. "My poor baby needs a proper meal," she'd say, pushing past me at 8 a.m. while I was already cooking. She'd throw out what I made and start over. "This is how he likes his eggs, dear. You'll learn eventually." My husband was the youngest of a family of 7, and the only boy, meaning he was a forever baby in his mother's eyes. At 18, she was still ordering for him at restaurants and forcing him to open his mouth so she could check if he brushed his teeth properly. Now that we're married, she sends me videos on how to iron his shirts and repeatedly texts how I'll never be able to care for him like she can. At the family reunion a couple of months ago, she, Nancy, introduced me to every single one of the 120 family members as Christian's wife who's still learning how to take care of him. She'd assembled a panel of aunts to teach me in front of everyone. "Now, dear, let me show you how to iron a man's shirt properly." She held up Christian's shirt like I was in kindergarten show and tell. "See how she's creased the collar wrong? This is why I still do Christian's laundry. I don't do it wrong. I run a household and a company." But Christian just sat there letting her demonstrate proper folding technique to a crowd of 40 women. When I mentioned I had a system that worked, Nancy laughed. "Oh, sweetie, watching YouTube videos isn't the same as real experience. I've been taking care of men for 40 years. During lunch, she announced to the table that she'd been secretly meal prepping for us. I found out she's been feeding my son frozen dinners. Can you imagine? That's why I drop off fresh meals every day. The meals she drops off go straight to the trash because I cook fresh every night." But Christian said nothing. Her sister asked about children and Nancy jumped in before I could speak. "Oh, she's not ready. She can barely take care of Christian. Yesterday she didn't even know you have to separate his work shirts from his gym clothes. I had to come over and restore his entire closet. She didn't have to. She broke in while we were at work." When dessert came, Nancy started her favorite story. "You should see her trying to manage their finances. Christian called me crying because she tried to create a budget in Excel. Bless her heart, she had the numbers all backwards. Now I manage their accounts so they don't end up homeless." Christian was never crying. "I have an MBA. I manage budgets for my company." But Christian just nodded along. The peak came during speeches. Nancy stood up with a microphone. "I want to toast my beautiful son and his wife. Christian, you know I worry about you every day, living with someone who tries her best. But don't worry, baby. Mama's always here. I've been teaching her how to use the washing machine." The entire room laughed. 120 people laughing at me. "Just yesterday," she continued, "I found her trying to clean the bathroom with the wrong products. She was using glass cleaner on the tiles. This is why I have to check on them every morning. Someone has to make sure my baby is taken care of properly." My husband's cousin leaned over. "You're so lucky Nancy helps you. Most of us had to figure it out alone." Nancy kept going. "She doesn't even know how to sew a button. Last week, Christian's shirt lost a button and she was going to throw it away. Throw away a perfectly good shirt. Thank God I was there. I sew. I hem my own clothes. I tailored Christian's suit for our wedding." But Christian just smiled at his mother like she was saving our marriage. When catering came to clear plates, Nancy grabbed my arm. "Watch how they do this, dear. Maybe you'll learn proper presentation." I keep telling Christian he should have married someone who went to finishing school, but we work with what we have. That's when the catering manager approached our table looking directly at me. "Miss Clark, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could I speak with you briefly about Monday's event?" Nancy laughed. "Oh, honey, you're confused. She doesn't work. She's just a housewife and barely managing that." The manager looked confused. "This is definitely Miss Clark. She's our biggest corporate client. She organizes catering for her company's events every week." Nancy's face went red. "That's impossible. She can't even cook eggs properly." "Ma'am, she runs Clark Industries, the marketing firm. They have 50 employees. She personally selects our menus for all their client meetings." He turned to me. "The $40,000 contract for next quarter. Do you want the seasonal menu or should we stick with the classic options?" I turned to stare at my mother-in-law. "Christian!" she yelled. The sound echoed through the whole banquet hall and every single person turned to stare at our table. Christian's face went completely white and he froze in his chair like a statue. The catering manager took a step back, clearly confused by what was happening. Nancy's hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the table. Christian finally stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Mom, there's been some kind of mix-up here." He put his hand on her shoulder. "This man obviously has my wife confused with someone else." Several relatives at nearby tables gasped at his words. The catering manager frowned and pulled out his phone. "No, sir, I'm quite certain." He turned the screen toward Nancy. "This is our client portal." My company website filled the screen with my professional photo right at the top. "Miss Clark, CEO and founder," was written in big letters underneath. Nancy stared at the phone and her whole body started trembling. Tears formed in her eyes as she slowly turned to look at Christian. "You knew?" Her voice cracked on the words. Christian couldn't even meet her eyes and just stared at the floor. His silence told everyone in that room the truth. He'd known about my career this whole time while letting his mother humiliate me in front of everyone. Nancy's sister stood up from her seat 2 tables over. "Why didn't you ever correct us about your job?" I pushed my chair back and stood up, keeping my hands steady on the table. Every time I tried to speak, Nancy talked over me or Christian changed the subject. The room exploded with whispered conversations as people started putting the pieces together. Christian's cousin, who had called me lucky earlier, looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. People were pulling out their phones and looking up my company. I could hear fragments of conversation from every direction. 50 employees? Someone said. "She runs a marketing firm?" Another voice added. "But Nancy said she couldn't even cook eggs," an aunt whispered. Nancy's face turned bright red and she slammed her hand on the table. "You've destroyed this family with your lies." She grabbed her purse and started pushing past chairs. Christian immediately ran after her without even looking at me. "Mom, wait." I sat there alone at the table with 120 confused relatives staring at me. People started approaching my table with questions. "So you really run a company?" Christian's second cousin asked. asked. Why did you let Nancy say all those things? An uncle wanted to know. I spent the next hour explaining my business while people kept apologizing for believing Nancy's stories. Some relatives seemed genuinely sorry, but others looked skeptical that I could really be successful. Marketing is a tough field, one of Christian's aunts said doubtfully. Are you sure you're the actual CEO? I showed them our company LinkedIn page and client testimonials. More apologies came, but Christian never returned to the reunion. Eventually, I grabbed my purse and left alone, walking past tables of whispering relatives. The parking lot was dark when I got to my car. The drive home felt longer than usual with my hands tight on the steering wheel. Christian's car was already in our driveway when I pulled up. Through the living room window, I could see him pacing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear. I could hear his voice even before I opened the front door. I know, Mom. I know she upset you. He was using that soothing tone he always used with her. I dropped my keys on the entry table and walked into the living room. Christian ended the call and immediately turned on me. How could you humiliate her like that? His face was red with anger. You should have found a better way to handle it. He gestured wildly with his hands. You made it seem like I orchestrated the whole thing with the catering manager. I stared at him in disbelief. I didn't plan for him to show up, Christian. He shook his head and kept pacing. You could have just agreed with my mom that it was a misunderstanding. His voice got louder. You didn't have to let him show her the website. He ran his hands through his hair. Now she's crying and says she can never show her face at family events again. He pointed at me accusingly. This is your fault for not being honest from the beginning. I opened my mouth to respond, but he kept going. If you had just told her about your job properly instead of hiding it, none of this would have happened. He grabbed his phone again. I need to go check on her. He headed for the door. She's threatening not to eat or sleep until this is resolved. He paused at the doorway. We're going to fix this, and you're going to apologize to her for embarrassing her in front of the entire family. The door slammed behind him, and I stood alone in our living room. My phone buzzed with texts from various relatives, some supportive and others asking for more details about the confrontation. I ignored them all and headed to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. My hands were still shaking slightly as I thought about what had just happened. Christian had chosen his mother over me again, just like he always did. I walked to the couch and sat down with my phone in my hand. The screen showed 3 months of Nancy's texts calling me stupid and useless and unable to care for her son. I scrolled through message after message where she said I couldn't cook or clean or do anything right. When Christian came back 2 hours later, his shirt was wrinkled and his eyes looked tired. I held up my phone to show him the texts, but he barely looked at them before shaking his head. She's just trying to help, he said. I scrolled to a text where Nancy called me a worthless wife who would ruin his life. Christian glanced at it for half a second, then walked to the kitchen. I followed him and showed more texts where she said I was too dumb to manage money or run a house. He opened the fridge and grabbed a beer without looking at my phone. You're taking this too personally, he said. I kept scrolling and showing him text after text, but he wouldn't really look at any of them. That night, I told him I was done pretending to be stupid just to make his mother feel better about herself. His face turned red and he started yelling about how I was being mean and trying to hurt his family. You've ruined my relationship with them, he shouted. He grabbed a pillow and blanket from our bedroom and threw them on the couch. I heard him moving around in the living room all night while I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, I heard Nancy's key in the front door while I was making scrambled eggs. She pushed past me and went straight to the stove where she grabbed the pan handle. At least someone needs to take care of my baby properly, she said. The eggs I'd been cooking went straight into the trash. She started cracking new eggs into the same pan like I wasn't even there. I reached over and took the pan from her hands, which made the eggs spill onto the stovetop. You need to leave, I said. Her eyes filled with tears, and she started sobbing about how I'd turned her son against her. Christian came running downstairs in his pajamas when he heard her crying. He went straight to his mother and wrapped his arms around her while she sobbed into his chest. It's okay, Mom. It's okay, he kept saying. They stood there hugging in my kitchen while egg yolk dripped down the front of the stove. I picked up my phone and called the first locksmith I found online. The woman who answered said they could come that afternoon at 3 o'clock. Nancy heard me giving our address and started screaming. You can't lock me out of my son's house, she yelled. Christian let go of his mother and turned to me with his mouth open. Cancel that right now, he said. I kept talking to the locksmith and confirmed the appointment. You're being completely unreasonable, Christian said. She has every right to visit her son. I told him that using a key to break in at 8 in the morning wasn't visiting. It's trespassing, I said. Nancy started crying harder, and Christian went back to hugging her. At 3 o'clock, the locksmith's van pulled into our driveway. Christian stood on the front lawn with his phone pressed to his ear while the locksmith changed all 3 locks on our house. I could hear him talking to his sisters through the open window. She's lost her mind, he said. She's trying to isolate me from my family. The locksmith worked on each door while Christian paced back and forth on the grass. I don't know what to do, he told someone on the phone. She's gone crazy. The locksmith handed me the new keys and I paid him while Christian kept making calls. Less than an hour later, a blue sedan pulled up and Mildred got out. She marched up to the front door where I was standing with the new keys in my hand. You need to respect your elders, she said. You're causing drama in this family and it needs to stop. She stood there with her hands on her hips like she was scolding a child. Nancy has done nothing but help you, and this is how you repay her? Mildred said. Her husband Luther got out of the car and walked up behind her. While Mildred kept talking about respect and family values, Luther caught my eye and nodded toward the side of the house. I followed him around the corner where we were out of sight. I get why you snapped, he said quietly. He looked back toward where Mildred was still standing at the front door. Nancy's been controlling these kids their whole lives, he said. Nobody ever stands up to her because they're all scared of her. He shook his head and looked tired. Christian's got it the worst since he's the baby and the only boy, Luther said. We walked back around to the front where Nancy had shown up and was sitting on the porch steps. She had her hand on her chest and was breathing heavy. Nancy, my heart, she said. The stress is making my heart act up. Christian ran over to her and knelt down. We need to get you to the hospital, he said. Luther walked over and put his fingers on Nancy's wrist to check her pulse. He looked at her eyes and felt her forehead. Your pulse is normal, he said. You're not having heart problems. Nancy glared at him, but he just shrugged. I'm a nurse, he said. I know what a heart problem looks like, and this isn't it. Nancy pushed herself up from the steps and walked to her car without saying another word to any of us. Christian followed her to the driveway and they talked for 10 minutes while I stood on the porch with Mildred and Luther. Mildred kept shaking her head and muttering about respect, while Luther just watched his brother-in-law comfort Nancy through her car window. After Nancy drove away, Christian came back to the house and walked past all of us without speaking. I heard him slam the bedroom door upstairs while Mildred told me I needed to fix this mess before it destroyed the family. Luther pulled her toward their car and they left without saying goodbye. That evening I sat at my laptop searching for family therapists, while Christian stayed locked in the bedroom. I found dozens of options, but one stood out because of her specialty in something called enmeshment issues. Adelaide Grimes had 20 years of experience, and her website talked about adult children who couldn't separate from their parents. I filled out the online form to request an appointment and put both our names down, even though Christian hadn't agreed to anything yet. The confirmation email came back within an hour, saying she had an opening in 3 days. I knocked on the bedroom door and told Christian through the wood that I'd made us a therapy appointment. He opened the door and stared at me for a long moment before surprising me completely. Fine, he said, but only so the therapist can explain to you how wrong you're being about my mother. He actually seemed happy about it, like he was sure any professional would take his side. She'll see that mom is just trying to help and you're the one causing problems, he said before closing the door again. The next morning at work, I went straight to my HR director's office and asked her to document everything about Nancy. I explained about the reunion and the morning break-ins and how she might try to interfere with my business. My HR director took notes and said she'd create a file immediately. Then I called down to security and gave them Nancy's description and license plate number. Under no circumstances is she allowed in this building, I told them. The security guard said they'd add her to the restricted list and alert all shifts. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with notifications from a group text Nancy had sent to 40 female relatives. She'd attached a photo from 2 months ago showing towels in our linen closet that weren't folded exactly the way she preferred. This is why I worry about my son's well-being, she'd written under the photo. The responses started coming immediately with laughing emojis and comments about how Nancy was such a good mother for caring so much. But then my phone started getting private messages from 3 different cousins and one of Christian's aunts. They all said basically the same thing about how Nancy had always been too involved, but nobody wanted to say anything because she got so upset. One cousin wrote that she'd been waiting years for someone to stand up to Nancy. 3 days later, Christian and I sat in Adelaide Grimes' waiting room in complete silence. He kept checking his phone and sighing loudly every few minutes. When Adelaide called us in, Christian walked ahead of me and sat down with his arms crossed. Adelaide asked us to explain why we were there, and Christian immediately launched into a speech about how I was trying to destroy his relationship with his mother. Adelaide listened without interrupting for 5 whole minutes while Christian talked about all the ways Nancy helped us. Then she asked me for my perspective, and I told her about the morning invasions and the public humiliation and the constant criticism. Christian kept trying to interrupt, but Adelaide held up her hand to stop him. Christian, what I'm hearing sounds like emotional incest, she said calmly. His face turned red and he stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. That's disgusting, he yelled. How dare you say something like that about my mother? He stormed out of the office and slammed the door so hard a picture fell off the wall. Adelaide picked up the picture and rehung it while I sat there not knowing what to do. Would you like to continue? She asked. I nodded and spent the next 40 minutes telling her everything while she took notes. She explained that enmeshment happens when parents can't let their children become independent adults. Christian's reaction is typical, she said. This kind of change takes serious work and he has to want it. She gave me some articles to read and said I could come back alone if Christian wouldn't return. The next day, I was in a meeting with 3 clients when my assistant knocked and said security needed me urgently. I excused myself and followed her to the lobby where 2 security guards were struggling with Nancy. She was yelling at the top of her lungs that I was abusing her son, and someone needed to stop me. My employees were gathering in the hallway to watch as Nancy tried to push past security toward the elevators. She's keeping my baby from me, Nancy screamed. She's brainwashing him. The security guards managed to get her outside, but she kept yelling through the glass doors. Several of my employees had their phones out recording the whole thing. After security got Nancy to leave, my HR director pulled me into her office. 3 different people recorded that, she said. I think you need to consider getting a restraining order. She showed me the videos on her phone and I could see how unhinged Nancy looked. I never thought I'd need a restraining order against my mother-in-law, I said. My HR director patted my shoulder and said she'd seen worse in her 30 years of HR work. That evening when Christian got home, I told him about his mother showing up at my office. His face got dark and he started pacing around the living room. You had her thrown out? He said. You embarrassed her in front of all those people? I explained that she was screaming about abuse, but he didn't care. You're deliberately trying to hurt her, he said. She was just worried about me and you had security drag her out like a criminal. I grabbed my phone and called Maximilian Pierce, the lawyer who handles all the contracts for Clark Industries. He listened while I explained everything about Nancy's behavior, the office incident, and the morning break-ins. Start documenting everything, he said. Screenshots, recordings, witness statements, all of it. He told me I had grounds for at least a cease and desist letter, and maybe more if she kept escalating. Christian watched me take notes during the call with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. The next morning, my phone rang during a board meeting and my assistant's face went white when she looked at the caller ID. She passed me a note that said my biggest client was on the line and it was urgent. I stepped out and took the call call and the client's voice was confused and worried. "Your mother-in-law just called me," she said. "She told me you're having a mental breakdown and shouldn't be trusted with our account." My stomach dropped as she explained how Nancy had somehow gotten her direct number and spent 20 minutes telling her I was unstable and needed help. The client knew me well enough to recognize something was off, but she was concerned about the whole situation. "I've worked with you for 5 years," she said. "I know you're not having a breakdown, but this is really bizarre." I thanked her for calling me directly and assured her everything was fine with our business relationship. When I got home that night, I told Christian his mother had called my biggest client and tried to destroy my professional reputation. His face actually went pale and he sat down hard on the couch. "She could have cost me a contract worth hundreds of thousands of dollars," I said. He opened his mouth to defend her like always, but then closed it again without saying anything. For the first time since this whole mess started, he looked genuinely shaken by what his mother had done. 3 days later, Adelaide Grimes called Christian directly and somehow convinced him to come back for another therapy session. I don't know what she said, but he agreed to try again. This time when we sat down in her office, he didn't cross his arms or act defensive. He actually stayed for the entire hour and listened while Adelaide explained enmeshment patterns and how parents sometimes can't let their children become independent adults. She used examples from other families, and Christian started nodding along like he was finally understanding something. About halfway through the session, Adelaide asked him directly about the reunion. "How did you feel when your mother was describing your wife as incompetent to your entire family?" Christian shifted in his chair and looked at the floor. "It was wrong," he said quietly. "She shouldn't have done that." It was the first time he'd ever admitted his mother had done anything wrong. Adelaide didn't push too hard, but I could see her making notes about his response. That night, Nancy found out Christian was back in therapy because one of his sisters saw our car at Adelaide's office. At 2 in the morning, we woke up to pounding on our front door and Nancy screaming Christian's name. She was sobbing and yelling that I was poisoning him against her. Christian got up to answer the door, but I grabbed his arm and shook my head. The pounding continued for 10 minutes before our neighbor called the police about the noise. 2 officers showed up and found Nancy trying to get in through our back door. They warned her about trespassing and disturbing the peace while Christian watched through the window. His mother was crying and telling the officers that her son was abused and brainwashed. The officers took down a report and told her she needed to leave or they'd have to arrest her. Nancy finally got in her car, but not before screaming that this wasn't over. The police report came in handy when Maximilian drafted the cease and desist letter. He sent it certified mail and Nancy received it 3 days later. Within an hour, Christian's phone was ringing nonstop with his mother sobbing about being threatened by lawyers. "Your wife is trying to destroy our family," she cried. Christian put her on speaker, and I could hear her gasping between sobs. He looked torn between comforting her and supporting me, but Adelaide had prepared him for this. In our next session, she helped him see the pattern of his mother using tears and guilt to control him. "Every time you set a boundary, she escalates," Adelaide pointed out. "Notice how she's never actually respecting what you've asked for?" She gave Christian homework to go 1 week without answering his mother's calls to see if he could break the pattern. Nancy didn't take that well and immediately recruited all 6 of Christian's sisters to pressure him. Our phone rang constantly with different siblings calling to say he was breaking their mother's heart. Mildred was the worst, leaving voicemails calling me a homewrecker who was destroying their family. "You've turned him against his own mother," she said in one message. "What kind of wife does that?" The calls kept coming at all hours until we had to turn off our phones at night. Christian's sisters took turns texting him photos of their mother crying and messages about how sick she was making herself with worry. Then something unexpected happened when Luther Schultz called Christian directly. "Your mother created this situation," he said loud enough that I could hear from across the room. "She refused to let you grow up and now she's facing the consequences of her own behavior." Mildred grabbed the phone from her husband and started yelling at him, but Luther took it back. "I'm tired of watching this circus," he said. "Nancy needs to accept that her son is a grown man with his own family now." The next morning at 3 a.m., I woke up to scratching sounds at our front door and grabbed my phone to check the Ring doorbell camera we'd installed last week. Nancy was jamming her old key into the lock over and over while muttering to herself about saving her baby from me. The key didn't work because we'd changed the locks, but she kept trying for 5 whole minutes before walking around to every window on the ground floor. She pushed at each one and even tried using a garden tool to pry open the bathroom window, while I recorded everything on my phone. Christian sat up in bed and watched the footage with his mouth hanging open as his mother climbed onto our porch furniture to reach a second-floor window. The security company arrived within 20 minutes after I called them about an active break-in and found Nancy still trying to get inside through the garage side door. They installed motion cameras on every corner of the house that same night, while Nancy sat in her car across the street watching and crying. Christian couldn't say anything to defend her after seeing the footage of his mother trying to break into our home like a burglar at 3 in the morning. He spent the rest of the night staring at his phone and typing out messages to her that he kept deleting until finally sending a short text at 6 a.m. Nancy's response came instantly as paragraph after paragraph filled his screen about how I'd poisoned him against her and stolen her baby boy. Christian showed me the messages where she called me every name imaginable and said I was abusing him by keeping him from his real family. 20 paragraphs of pure rage arrived over the next hour, with accusations that I was controlling him and had probably drugged him to make him act this way. At work that morning, my assistant knocked on my office door and said she'd been screening calls from a woman claiming to be my mother-in-law who kept demanding to speak to me. My whole team had witnessed Nancy's meltdown when security removed her from our building, and now they were protective of me in ways I hadn't expected. 3 employees offered to write statements about what they'd seen if I needed them for legal reasons, and my HR director kept detailed records of every call. The receptionist started a log of Nancy's attempts to get past the front desk, using different fake names and reasons for visiting. My assistant even even changed our meeting schedule so Nancy couldn't predict when I'd be arriving or leaving the building. 2 weeks passed with daily harassment until Nancy tried her most dramatic move yet by collapsing on our front lawn one evening as we pulled into the driveway. She was lying on the grass, clutching her chest and moaning about chest pains when we got out of the car. Christian pulled out his phone and called 911 for an ambulance but didn't run to help her, which surprised both me and Nancy, who kept peeking to see if he was coming. The paramedics arrived quickly and checked her vitals while she insisted Christian needed to ride with her to the hospital because she might be dying. One of the paramedics pulled us aside after examining her and quietly mentioned this was the 3rd time this month they'd been called for Nancy, having these exact same symptoms. They found nothing wrong with her heart rate or blood pressure, but suggested she might benefit from talking to someone about anxiety or other issues. Nancy heard this and started screaming at them about being incompetent and not knowing a real emergency when they saw one. Adelaide brought up the idea of a joint therapy session at our next appointment, but said Nancy would need to agree to ground rules first. I called Nancy that afternoon to suggest it, and she laughed before saying she wasn't going to be ganged up on by her son's manipulative wife and a quack therapist. She went on a 10-minute rant about how therapy was for weak people, and she'd raised 7 children without needing some stranger to tell her how to live. Christian made the hardest decision of his life that week by telling his mother he needed 30 days of no contact to focus on our marriage. Nancy's reaction was immediate with voicemails that started sad and worried, but grew more hostile with each message Adelaide said was typical for this situation. The family exploded into different camps with 3 of his sisters supporting Nancy, while the other 3 admitted she'd always been too controlling. Luther became our strongest supporter by calling Christian directly to share stories about Nancy's behavior when his father was still alive. He told us about times Nancy would show up at his father's work to check on him or follow him to make sure he wasn't talking to other women. Luther had watched this pattern for 40 years and said Nancy's mother-in-law had treated her the exact same way, which explained where it came from. Nancy's own mother-in-law had called her stupid and incompetent daily, while criticizing every meal she cooked and every decision she made about raising the children. Christian started understanding that his mother was repeating patterns from her own trauma, but that didn't mean we had to accept the behavior in our lives. Adelaide helped him see that breaking the cycle was actually the healthiest thing he could do for everyone, including Nancy, who might finally get help. 4 weeks into the no-contact period, our house felt different, with quiet mornings where we could drink coffee together without waiting for the door to burst open. Christian started making breakfast on weekends, which he'd never done before because his mother always insisted on doing it for him. He made simple things like scrambled eggs and toast, but seemed proud of himself for learning something his mother never let him try. Our mornings became peaceful without the constant anxiety of waiting for Nancy to show up and tell us everything we were doing wrong. The anniversary of Christian's father's death was 2 weeks later, and Nancy knew we always visited the cemetery at 10 in the morning. Christian spotted her car in the parking lot before we even pulled in, and his hands tightened on the steering wheel. She was standing by the grave with flowers, wearing all black like she'd just lost him yesterday instead of 5 years ago. Christian parked 3 spaces away, and we walked toward the grave together, while Nancy watched us approach with red eyes. She started crying harder when we got close and reached out her arms toward Christian, but he stepped back and shook his head. We placed our flowers on the opposite side of the headstone from hers and stood there in silence for maybe 2 minutes before Christian took my hand and started walking back to the car. Nancy followed us halfway across the cemetery, calling his name over and over, but he never turned around. That same afternoon, his sister called me directly for the first time in 3 years. She said she'd been thinking about the reunion and realized how awful Nancy had been to me. 2 more sisters called that week with similar apologies and asked if we could start fresh. Mildred was the only holdout who kept insisting I was destroying the family, but the other 3 seemed genuine about wanting to repair things. Christian started opening up more in therapy about how he'd failed me as a husband. Adelaide had him write out specific instances where he should have defended me, and he filled 3 pages in one session. He apologized that night for letting his mother humiliate me at the reunion, and for every time he'd chosen her comfort over mine. The change in him was real because he started noticing things Nancy did that he'd ignored before. Luther called us the following week to tell us he'd given Nancy an ultimatum about getting therapy, or he'd move out. She'd thrown things and screamed, but he'd stood firm and even packed a bag to show he was serious. Nancy finally agreed to see someone and asked Adelaide for a referral, which felt like she was actually trying. Adelaide gave her 3 names, and Nancy picked the one who specialized in family dynamics and boundary issues. 3 months after the reunion, we decided to test the waters by hosting dinner with the 3 sisters who'd apologized. Christian cooked the entire meal himself without calling his mother for advice even once. His sisters were shocked when they arrived and saw him wearing an apron and pulling a roast from the oven. They kept looking at each other like they couldn't believe their baby brother knew how to use a kitchen. The dinner went well, and nobody mentioned Nancy until dessert, when one sister admitted she'd enabled the behavior for years. She said watching Nancy at the reunion made her realize how cruel they'd all been to let it continue. The others agreed, and we actually had a nice evening talking about normal things like work and vacation plans. 2 weeks later was Christian's cousin's wedding, and we knew Nancy would be there since she was the groom's aunt. Christian practiced with Adelaide what he'd say if his mother approached us, and we arrived prepared for anything. Nancy was already there when we walked in and immediately started toward us, but Christian held up his hand to stop her. She tried to comment on my dress being too short for a church wedding, and Christian said firmly that my dress was perfect, and she needed to stop. The entire reception hall went quiet, as everyone watched Christian choose me over his mother in public for the first time. Nancy's face turned red, but she walked away without another word and avoided us the rest of the night. Several relatives came up afterward to say they were proud of Christian for finally standing up to her. A month later, we received a letter from Nancy that Adelaide helped us process in therapy, Nancy. The letter wasn't perfect and had some defensive parts, but she did acknowledge that she'd been wrong to interfere in our marriage. She wrote that therapy was helping her understand why she felt the need to control everything, and that she was working on it. Adelaide suggested we could try supervised visits at neutral locations if we wanted to test whether Nancy could respect boundaries. We decided to meet her for coffee at a place downtown, with a 1-hour time limit and clear rules about what topics were off limits. Nancy showed up 10 minutes early and actually followed the rules for the entire hour without a single insult or criticism. She asked about my company and listened when I talked about our new contracts without interrupting or dismissing anything. 6 months after that horrible reunion, our marriage felt stronger than it had ever been. Christian woke up early to make us breakfast every Sunday and hadn't called his mother for advice in months. Nancy managed her monthly 1-hour visits without insulting me, and even complimented a presentation I gave at a business conference she attended. Christian had learned to be a husband first and son second, which made all the difference in how we functioned as a couple. My company landed 3 major new clients and was thriving better than ever. Nancy even told Luther that I was adequate at running a business, which coming from her was basically the highest praise possible. Thanks for hanging out with me through all these questions and wonderings today. I had a lot of fun just sharing this time with you all and seeing where it went. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.